blood, bourbon, and $1 billion betrayal. Victor Castiglione was seconds away from signing away his entire shipping empire, relying on a translator who was quietly selling him to the slaughterhouse. He didn't know it. The German wolves sitting across the mahogany table didn't know their plot was unraveling. But Penelope Gallagher knew. She was just the fat, invisible waitress refilling their water glasses. But she spoke fluent German. She knew a death sentence when she heard one. "Your translator is lying," she whispered. Penelope Gallagher knew exactly how the world saw her. At 240 pounds, she was consistently treated as either a comfortable piece of furniture or an invisible entity, entirely devoid of consequence. In the hyper-masculine, dangerous world of the Monarch Room, an ultra-exclusive invite-only dining club hidden beneath the bustling streets of Manhattan, being invisible was her greatest asset. She didn't possess the razor-sharp cheekbones or the willowy figures of the other hostesses. She was soft, rounded, and carried her weight with a quiet dignity that most of the high-rolling criminals mistook for docility. Because she was fat, the men in custom Tom Ford suits didn't try to slip hotel keycards into her apron. They didn't lower their voices when she poured their $200 glasses of Pappy Van Winkle bourbon. To the titans of the underworld, she was simply the help, a non-entity. That was their first mistake. Penelope's mother had been a military linguist stationed in Munich, and Penelope had spent the first 18 years of her life immersed in the harsh, guttural beauty of the German language. She dreamed in German. She read Goethe for fun. But here, in the dim, amber-lit basement of the Monarch Room, she was just Penny, the heavy-set girl who knew exactly how to balance a tray of crystal decanters without making a sound. Tonight, the private dining room was suffocatingly tense. The air conditioning was cranked low, yet the men at the table were sweating. At the head of the heavy oak table sat Victor Castiglione. Victor was a man carved from granite and violence. As the undisputed head of the Castiglione crime family, he controlled the eastern seaboard's ports with an iron, unforgiving grip. He was 34, devastatingly handsome in a brutal, scarred sort of way, and possessed eyes the color of a bruised winter sky. He rarely spoke. When he did, men usually bled. Across from Victor sat Dieter Kaufmann, an executive from Rhine-Ruhr Logistics, a legitimate front for the largest organized crime syndicate in Berlin. Dieter was flanked by two massive men whose tailored jackets barely concealed the bulges of Heckler & Koch MP5K's shoulder rigs. Victor's empire was looking to expand into European shipping lanes. Dieter had the European ports. It was supposed to be a marriage of convenience, brokered by a multi-million-dollar contract sitting on the table between them. Sitting to Victor's right was Oliver Trent, his trusted translator. Oliver was slick, wearing a suit that was a little too shiny, his hair slicked back with an expensive pomade. Victor did not speak a word of German, and Dieter absolutely refused to speak English, citing a twisted sense of nationalistic pride. Oliver was the bridge. Penelope stood perfectly still in the corner of the room, blending into the heavy velvet drapes. Her black uniform strained slightly against her generous curves, her breathing shallow as she waited for the signal to refresh their drinks. Dieter Kaufmann leaned forward, steepling his fingers. He looked directly at Victor and spoke in rapid, quiet German. Sobald die Verträge unterzeichnet sind, werden wir seine Hafenmeister in New Jersey ausschalten. Meine Männer übernehmen noch heute Nacht die Docks. Wenn aufwacht, wird nichts mehr haben. Penelope's blood turned to ice in her veins. She blinked, her heart slamming against her ribs like a trapped bird. She understood every single word. Once the contracts are signed, we will eliminate his harbor masters in New Jersey. My men are taking over the docks tonight. By the time he wakes up, he will have nothing. It was a total hostile takeover. A massacre. Dieter wasn't partnering with Victor. He was planning to butcher his lieutenants and steal his empire the second the ink dried on the paper. Penelope shifted her gaze to Oliver Trent, waiting for the slick translator to relay the death threat. Oliver offered a smooth, reassuring smile to Victor. Mr. Kaufman says that once the contracts are signed, he will seamlessly integrate your harbor masters in New Jersey with his European team. Oliver translated smoothly, his voice dripping with professional calm. He anticipates a highly profitable transition by morning. Penelope felt the room spin. Oliver Trent was lying. Oliver wasn't just mistranslating. He was actively participating in the coup. He had been bought. The realization crashed over her with the force of a freight train. Victor Castiglione, a man feared by the FBI and the Sicilian mob alike, was sitting in a velvet-lined room, blindly walking into a slaughterhouse because he trusted the man sitting next to him. Victor nodded slowly, his piercing blue eyes locked on Dieter. He reached into the breast pocket of his charcoal suit and pulled out a heavy gold Mont Blanc fountain pen. He uncapped it. Penelope's hands began to shake. If she stayed silent, she would be complicit in a massacre. Hundreds of men on the New Jersey docks would die tonight. Victor would be systematically dismantled and likely murdered. But if she spoke up, she was a waitress. A fat, insignificant waitress in a room full of apex predators. If she interrupted a sit-down of this magnitude, Victor's own bodyguards, standing stone-faced by the door, might shoot her before she even got a word out. Dieter smiled, a cold, reptilian curving of his lips, and gestured to the contract. Lass den Idioten unterschreiben, und dann überweisen wir dir deine 2 Millionen, Oliver, Dieter added casually in German. Let the idiot sign, and then we will wire you your 2 million, Oliver. Oliver didn't even flinch. He just gave a curt nod to Victor. He says it is an honor to do business with you, boss. Victor brought the gold nib of the pen to the thick parchment. Penelope couldn't breathe. The silence in the room was deafening, broken only by the faint scratch of Victor's pen hovering over the signature line. The world seemed to slow down. She looked at Victor's broad shoulders, his hardened jawline. I was a criminal, yes, but the sheer, treacherous cowardice of what was happening in front of her made her stomach churn. She gripped the silver tray in her hands. She had to do it. It was suicide, but she had to do it. Moving with a grace that often surprised people who only saw her size, Penelope stepped away from the velvet drapes. Her soft, rubber-soled shoes made absolutely no sound against the Persian rug. She didn't rush. Rushing would draw the eyes of the bodyguards. Instead, she adopted the practiced, subservient glide of a waitress executing her duties. She picked up a crystal water pitcher filled with ice and cucumber slices. Victor's pen touched the paper. A tiny dot of black ink bloomed on the signature line. Penelope approached Victor's right side, slipping seamlessly right behind Oliver Trent. She leaned down, bringing the pitcher toward Victor's half-empty glass. As she did, she deliberately knocked her hip against Oliver's chair, not hard enough to cause a scene, but just enough to make the translator jolt forward, spilling a few drops of his own drink onto his cuff. "Oh, my apologies, sir," Penelope gasped softly, her voice a pitch-perfect imitation of a terrified servant. Oliver cursed under his breath, glaring at her, distracted as he frantically dabbed at his expensive silk sleeve with a napkin. For 2 critical seconds, his attention was completely diverted from Victor. In that minuscule window, Penelope leaned over Victor's shoulder, pretending to reach for his water glass. Her soft, full breasts brushed against the rigid muscle of his back, and she lowered her face until her lips were a fraction of an inch from his ear. "Your translator is lying," she breathed, her voice so low it was practically a vibration. "Do not sign. They are killing your men in Jersey tonight. Oliver is getting $2 million to sell you out." Victor Castiglione did not gasp. He did not jump. He did not snap his head to look at her. To the rest of the room, absolutely nothing had happened. But Penelope, hovering just above him, felt the immediate, terrifying change in his body. The muscles in his back turned to absolute steel. The ambient temperature around him seemed to plummet. The hand holding the Mont Blanc pen froze, the knuckles turning bone white under the harsh overhead lighting. Penelope finished pouring the water, her hands trembling so violently she nearly chipped the crystal rim. She immediately stepped back, pressing herself against the wall, bowing her head in a posture of total submission. Her heart beat frantically against her sternum. "I'm a dead woman. I am going to die in this basement." Victor slowly lifted the pen away from the paper. He screwed the cap back on with agonizing slowness. The soft click echoed like a gunshot in the silent room. Dieter Kaufmann frowned, his reptilian smile faltering. He spat a harsh question in German. "Was ist los? Warum zögert er? What is wrong? Why is he hesitating?" Oliver Trent, having finally wiped his sleeve, quickly turned to Victor, his face a mask of false confusion. "Mr. Kaufmann is asking if there is a problem with the contract, boss." Victor leaned back in his leather chair. He didn't look at Oliver. He didn't look at Dieter. Slowly, deliberately, Victor turned his head and looked past the table, his bruising winter sky eyes locking directly onto Penelope. For the first time in her life, Penelope felt truly seen. Victor's gaze didn't wash over her body with the usual dismissal men gave her. He looked at her with a terrifying, piercing intensity, analyzing her existence, her pulse, her motive. It lasted only a second, but it felt like an eternity. Then Victor turned his attention back to his translator. "Oliver," Victor said, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that commanded absolute authority. "Ask Mr. Kaufmann what time the transition in New Jersey is supposed to take place." Oliver blinked, a bead of sweat suddenly forming at his hairline. "Boss, the contract doesn't specify a time. It's an ongoing integration." "Ask him anyway," Victor commanded softly. Oliver swallowed hard. He turned to Dieter and spoke in heavily accented German. Fragt nach dem Zeitplan für New Jersey. He is asking about the timeline for New Jersey. Dieter looked annoyed. "Sag ihm, dass es ihn nichts mehr angeht. Ist bald tot. Tell him it is none of his business anymore. He is dead soon." Penelope squeezed her eyes shut. Oliver turned back to Victor, forcing a bright diplomatic smile. "Mr. Kaufmann says the transition will begin at dawn tomorrow, giving your men plenty of time to prepare." Victor stared at Oliver. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Victor slowly reached out and picked up his glass of Pappy Van Winkle. He took a sip, letting the amber liquid burn down his throat. "Is that right?" Victor murmured. "Yes, boss." "Dawn," Oliver lied smoothly. Without breaking eye contact with Oliver, Victor casually reached under the heavy oak table. In one fluid, blindingly fast motion, he withdrew a customized Beretta 92 FS with a suppressed barrel and fired directly through the wood. Thwip. Oliver Trent screamed, violently pitching backward as his chair tipped over. He hit the floor writhing, clutching his shattered kneecap, blood instantly pooling on the Persian rug. Chaos erupted. Dieter Kaufmann shouted, lunging backward. His two massive bodyguards reached into their jackets for their MP5Ks. But Victor's men were already moving. The bodyguards at the door drew their weapons, moving with terrifying, synchronized precision. Before the Germans could even clear leather, the cold muzzles of 3 Glocks were pressed firmly against the backs of their skulls. "Sit down, Dieter," Victor said in English. Dieter froze, his hands hovering in the air. Victor stood up slowly, towering over the table. He walked around to where Oliver was sobbing and thrashing on the ground. Victor looked down at the traitor with absolute disgust, then looked across the room at the terrified waitress, trembling against the wall. "Come here," Victor commanded. Penelope couldn't move. Her legs felt like lead. She was crying now, tears spilling hot and fast down her cheeks. "I said, come here," Victor repeated, his tone softening a fraction, though still echoing with absolute command. Trembling violently, Penelope stepped forward, navigating around the bleeding translator until she stood in front of the most dangerous man in the city. She kept her head down, too afraid to meet his eyes. Victor reached out. His large, calloused hand gently lifted her chin, forcing her to look up at him. Up close, he smelled of expensive cologne, gunpowder, and danger. "What is your name?" Victor asked quietly. Penelope," she stammered, her chest heaving with panicked breaths. "Penny." "Tell me, Penny," Victor said, his thumb lightly brushing a tear from her cheek, a gesture so intimate and shocking she gasped. "What did our German friend just say before I shot Oliver?" Penelope swallowed the lump in her throat. She looked at Dieter Kaufmann, who was staring at her with wide, horrified realization. "He said it was none of your business anymore," Penelope whispered, her voice shaking but her translation flawless. "Because you would be dead soon." Victor smiled. It wasn't a nice smile. It was the smile of a predator that had just cornered its prey. He dropped his hand from Penelope's chin and turned his terrifying gaze back to Dieter. "Well, Dieter," Victor said, raising his Beretta and pointing it directly between the German executive's eyes. "It seems my new translator disagrees." Gunpowder stung the back of Penelope's throat, entirely masking the rich aroma of roasted duck and truffle oil that had lingered in the Monarch room just minutes prior. The ambient jazz music playing softly from the overhead speakers felt obscenely cheerful against the backdrop of Oliver Trent's muffled, agonizing sobs. Penelope stood frozen, her sturdy, practical waitress shoes rooted to the Persian rug, surrounded by men who killed for a living. Victor Castiglione did not look like a man who had just fired a weapon in a crowded, exclusive restaurant. He looked remarkably calm. He kept the suppressed Beretta leveled precisely at Dieter Kaufmann's forehead, his finger hovering over the trigger with terrifying patience. "Translate for me, Penny," Victor said, his voice dropping into a smooth, deadly cadence. He didn't look at her, keeping his eyes locked on the German executive, but his tone wrapped around her like a heavy, protective coat. Ask him exactly how many men he sent to Port Newark, and ask him who his inside contact is at the Maha terminals. Penelope's breath hitched. She knew the Maha terminals. It was the largest multi-user container terminal complex on the East Coast, a sprawling labyrinth of steel and cargo where Victor's family made the bulk of their illicit fortunes. She swallowed hard, trying to force the terror down her throat. She looked at Dieter, whose arrogant, reptilian facade had completely melted into pale, sweating panic. Wie viele Männer haben Sie nach Port Newark geschickt? Penelope's voice trembled slightly at first, but the sheer muscle memory of the language took over, her accent flawless, cutting through the heavy silence of the room. Und wer ist Ihr Kontaktmann bei den Maha Terminals? Dieter glared at her, a flash of pure, venomous hatred crossing his eyes. He realized instantly that this soft, invisible woman in a black apron had just single-handedly unraveled a 2-year corporate espionage operation. He clamped his jaw shut and spat a glob of blood and saliva onto the pristine tablecloth. Fick dich, du fette Schlampe, Dieter snarled. Penelope flinched, stepping back instinctively as the cruel German insult hit her. Fuck you, you fat bitch. She had spent her entire life insulating herself against those kinds of words, building a fortress out of quiet compliance and invisibility. But hearing it spat in a room full of loaded guns made her eyes burn with fresh, humiliating tears. Victor noticed the flinch. He noticed the sudden, downward shift of her gaze. His blue eyes darkened, a dangerous shadow crossing his scarred features. What did he say to you? Victor demanded, his voice suddenly void of all patience. He refused to answer, Mr. Castiglione, Penelope stammered, wrapping her arms around her waist, desperately wishing she could shrink into nothingness. I didn't ask if he refused. I asked what he said. Victor took a deliberate step toward Dieter, the muzzle of the Beretta pressing directly against the bridge of the German's nose. Word for word, Penny. Do not lie to me. He called me a fat bitch, Penelope whispered, her cheeks flushing crimson. A profound, suffocating stillness fell over the room. Even Oliver, bleeding profusely on the floor, stopped whimpering. Victor's trusted men, standing by the doors, shifted their weight, their expressions turning grim. They knew their boss. They knew the sudden drop in temperature in his demeanor. Victor slowly lowered the gun from Dieter's head. He looked at the German executive with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. You come into my city, Victor whispered, his voice dangerously soft. You attempt to butcher my men, you bribe my people, you try to steal my docks, and then you insult the only woman in this room who had the spine to look me in the eye and tell me the truth. Without warning, Victor pivoted sharply. He didn't shoot Dieter. Instead, he aimed the Beretta at the floor and pulled the trigger. Oliver Trent shrieked as a second bullet shattered his other kneecap. The traitor convulsed, vomiting onto the rug from the sheer, blinding agony. Dieter screamed in horror, scrambling backward until his chair hit the wall. Listen to me very carefully, Dieter, Victor said, switching back to English, knowing Penelope would translate the brutality flawlessly. I am going to start shooting pieces off of your new business partner until you tell me who the mole is at the Maha terminals. And if Oliver bleeds out before you speak, I will start shooting pieces off of you. Translate it, Penny. Penelope's chest heaved. She looked at the blood pooling around her sensible shoes. She looked at the terrifying, beautiful monster of a man standing before her, violently defending her honor in the only language he knew. Drawing a deep, shaky breath, she stood up straighter, allowing her broad shoulders to square. She turned to Dieter and translated Victor's threat with absolute, chilling precision. Her German was no longer trembling. It was as cold and sharp as cracked ice. Dieter broke. The sight of Oliver writhing in a pool of his own blood, combined with Victor's dead-eyed stare, completely shattered the German's resolve. "Es ist Mercer!" Dieter screamed, throwing his hands up in surrender. "Caleb Mercer, ist der Betriebsleiter der Terminals. Hat die Tore für meine Männer geöffnet. Sie sind mit 3 Lastwagen voller Söldner auf dem Weg." Penelope turned to Victor, her heart hammering. "Caleb Mercer. He's the operations man at the terminals. Dieter says Mercer opened the gates for his men. They have 3 trucks of mercenaries already on their way." Victor's jaw tightened. Caleb Mercer was one of his most trusted civilian contractors. The betrayal ran deep. Victor nodded slowly, processing the tactical nightmare unfolding across the Hudson River. "Dominic!" Victor barked, not looking away from Dieter. A tall, broad-shouldered man with a jagged scar across his chin stepped forward from the shadows of the door. "Yeah, boss. Tie these 3 up, bleed them, but keep them alive. Lock down the Monarch room. Nobody gets out." Victor holstered his weapon and reached for his suit jacket, draped over the back of a chair. "Call the strike teams in Jersey. Tell them to execute Protocol Black at the Maher terminals. I want Caleb Mercer's head in a bag by sunrise." "On it," Dominic said, already pulling a secure satellite phone from his jacket. Victor shrugged into his suit jacket, adjusting his cuffs with unnerving calm. He then turned his full attention back to Penelope. She was shaking again, the adrenaline beginning to crash. She realized, with a sickening drop in her stomach, that she had just signed her own death warrant. She had exposed a massive international syndicate. She could never go back to her small apartment in Queens. She could never go back to pouring water. "You," Victor said, pointing a finger at her. "You're coming with me." I can't," Penelope whispered, clutching her tray to her chest like a shield. "My shift isn't over. My manager." "Your manager works for me. This entire club belongs to me," Victor interrupted, stepping into her personal space. He looked down at her, his eyes tracing the soft curve of her jaw, the terrified flush of her cheeks, the fierce intelligence hiding behind her thick lashes. "You just saved my life, Penelope. But you also just made yourself a target for the Rhine-Ruhr cartel. If you walk out the back door of this kitchen tonight, you will be dead before you reach the subway." He reached out, gently prying the silver tray from her trembling fingers and tossing it onto the table. "From this second forward, you work for me," Victor stated, his tone leaving absolutely no room for debate. "Let's go." Rain began to lash violently against the reinforced bulletproof glass of the heavily modified Cadillac Escalade as it tore away from the clandestine rear exit of the Monarch room. The tires shrieked against the wet New York asphalt, aggressively merging onto the West Side Highway. Inside the cavernous, leather-scented cabin of the SUV, the atmosphere was suffocating. Penelope sat violently pressed into the plush captain's chair, her hands gripping the armrests so hard her knuckles were white. She was still wearing her uniform, the black apron now speckled with microscopic, horrifying drops of Oliver Trent's blood. She felt massive and clumsy in the luxurious space, acutely aware of how much room her thighs took up on the seat, how her chest heaved with every panicked breath. She was trapped in a rolling fortress with 2 stone-cold killers. Victor sat beside her, his long legs stretched out, his demeanor entirely focused on a secure tablet illuminated in the dim cabin light. Up front, Dominic gripped the steering wheel, driving with an aggressive, terrifying precision, weaving through the late-night traffic at 80 miles an hour. "ETA to the Holland Tunnel is 4 minutes, boss," Dominic called back over his shoulder. "Keep pushing," Victor replied, not looking up from his screen. He was watching live satellite feeds of the Maha terminals. Mercer's men have disabled the primary security grid at Port Newark. Our boys are going in blind. Penelope stared out the window at the blurring streetlights, feeling completely unmoored. "Where are you taking me?" she asked, her voice sounding incredibly small over the roar of the massive engine. Victor finally looked up. He set the tablet on his lap and turned to face her. In the shadowy light of the street lamps passing by, his scarred face looked less like a monster and more like a weary general. "I have a secure penthouse in Hoboken," Victor said, his voice surprisingly gentle compared to the violence he had just unleashed. "It's off the books, fortified. You'll be safe there until I eradicate the German problem." "I have a cat," Penelope blurted out, the absurdity of the statement leaving her lips before she could stop it. "In Queens. I have a tabby cat named Barnaby. He needs his wet food at 6 in the morning." Dominic snorted from the front seat, a sharp sound of amusement. Victor, however, did not laugh. He stared at her with a profound, unblinking intensity. "Dominic will send a team to retrieve Barnaby and all your belongings by tomorrow afternoon," Victor said, completely deadpan, as if organizing a tactical extraction for a house cat was standard Mafia protocol. "What else?" Penelope blinked, stunned. What else what? What else do I need to know about you, Penelope?" Victor leaned closer, the scent of gunpowder and bergamot invading her senses. "You don't just speak German. You understood military-grade tactical slang. Dieter used specific Rhine-Ruhr operational codes, and you translated them without missing a beat. A waitress doesn't learn that in high school." Penelope swallowed, her throat incredibly dry. "My mother," she whispered, looking down at her hands. "She was a master linguist for the United States Army, stationed in Munich for 18 years. I grew up on base. She didn't just teach me the language. She taught me how to intercept it. She used to make me listen to old Stasi recordings to practice identifying regional dialects." Victor's eyes widened slightly, a genuine flicker of respect crossing his features. "You were raised by a military intelligence officer. No wonder you didn't faint when the shooting started." "I'm terrified, Mr. Castiglione," Penelope admitted, a single tear slipping free. "I'm just a fat girl who pours drinks. I don't belong in this world. I don't want to be in this world." Victor reached across the center console. He didn't grab her hand. He simply rested his large, warm palm over her white-knuckled grip on the armrest. The heat of his touch sent a violent, confusing shiver up her spine. "You aren't just a girl who pours drinks, Penny," Victor said fiercely, his thumb brushing over her skin. "You are the woman who just saved the Castiglione Empire. And in my world, loyalty like that is paid back in blood and gold. You are under my protection now. Anyone who looks at you wrong will have to answer to me." Before Penelope could process the overwhelming weight of his promise, the radio scanner bolted to the dashboard, erupted in a burst of harsh, static-laced German. Dominic cursed. "Boss, we're picking up localized VHF radio chatter. It's unencrypted." Penelope's military upbringing snapped into focus. She leaned forward, straining to hear the garbled transmission over the static. "Ziel nähert sich dem Tunnel. Straßensperre bereit. Feuer frei auf die Reifen. Penelope's blood ran completely cold. She recognized the sharp, clipped Munich dialect. It wasn't coming from New Jersey. It was coming from right outside. "Dominic, stop the car!" Penelope screamed, her voice tearing through the cabin. "What?" Dominic yelled, looking in the rearview mirror. "They said the target is approaching the tunnel. Roadblock is ready. Fire on the tires," Penelope shrieked, pointing frantically at the road ahead. "It's an ambush!" Dominic slammed on the heavy brakes of the Escalade just as they rounded the final curve before the Holland tunnel entrance. The massive SUV fishtailed violently on the wet asphalt. A split second later, a deafening volley of automatic gunfire erupted from the shadows of an underpass. Heavy-caliber rounds slammed into the front grille of the Escalade, tearing through the hood and violently spiderwebbing the bulletproof windshield. "Get down!" Victor roared, throwing his entire massive body over Penelope, pinning her against the leather seat as the world exploded into chaos. Gunfire deafened the interior of the Cadillac. High-velocity rounds slammed against the reinforced armor plating of the Escalade like a barrage of steel hail. Sparks showered across the dark, rain-slicked pavement of the Holland tunnel approach as Dominic fought to keep the massive, fishtailing vehicle under control. Heavy, unyielding, and entirely shielding her from the chaotic violence. Outside, Victor Castiglione pressed Penelope into the plush leather seat. She could feel the hard lines of his custom suit, the solid wall of muscle beneath it, and the steady, terrifyingly calm rhythm of his heart against her shoulder. To Victor, this was just a Thursday. To Penelope, a woman whose biggest daily anxiety was usually balancing a tray of expensive martinis, it was a descent into hell. "Armor-piercing rounds, boss!" Dominic shouted over the deafening cacophony, his hands frantically spinning the steering wheel. "The passenger side glass is spider webbing. It won't hold another sustained burst." Victor didn't flinch. He kept one hand firmly braced against the headrest behind Penelope's hair, protecting her skull, while his other hand drew a customized Sig Sauer P-26 from a tactical holster at his waist. "Keep us moving, Dom!" Victor roared back. "Do not let them pin us against the concrete barriers." Penelope's ears rang violently, but her military-honed instincts, buried deep beneath years of civilian life, suddenly violently awakened. The VHF scanner on the dashboard was still spitting out jagged, static-filled bursts of German. "Flankiert sie von links! Konzentriert das Feuer auf den Motorblock!" Penelope violently shoved against Victor's chest, creating just enough space to breathe. "Left!" she screamed, her voice cracking with terror. "Dominic, they're flanking from the left. They are aiming for the engine block." Without hesitating for a fraction of a second, Dominic violently jerked the steering wheel to the right. The 3-ton Escalade lurched aggressively, its heavy tires mounting the concrete median, just as a devastating volley of automatic gunfire tore through the exact space the engine block had occupied a millisecond prior. "Christ," Dominic breathed, his eyes wide in the rearview mirror. "Good ear, Penny. Schießt auf die Reifen. Lasst sie nicht entkommen. Wir brauchen ihn lebend für die biometrischen Daten." The radio crackled again. Penelope grabbed Victor's lapels, her wide, terrified eyes locking onto his piercing blue ones in the dim, strobing light of the street lamps. "Victor, they aren't trying to kill you. The commander just ordered them to shoot the tires. He said they need you alive for your biometric data." Victor's jaw locked into a brutal, dangerous line. The Rhine-Ruhr cartel didn't just want his ports. They wanted the offshore Caymans accounts. Dieter Kaufmann knew that the Castiglione billions were secured behind retinal scans and voice print locks. They were trying to capture him to physically harvest his biometrics. "They want my eyes," Victor said softly, a terrifyingly cold smile touching the corners of his mouth. "Dominic, change of plans. Ram the black Mercedes, blocking the ramp. We are not playing defense tonight." Dominic grinned, a feral expression that mirrored his boss's. "Brace yourselves." The massive engine of the Escalade roared like a wounded beast as Dominic slammed his foot down on the accelerator. The heavy SUV vaulted off the median, its reinforced steel front bumper accelerating straight toward a black Mercedes G-Wagon, positioned horizontally across the tunnel's entrance lane. Penelope squeezed her eyes shut and braced her heavy frame against the seat. The impact was apocalyptic. Metal shrieked, glass exploded, and the heavy Mercedes was violently shoved backward, scraping along the concrete with a horrific squeal. The Escalade shuddered violently, the radiator hissing a thick cloud of white steam into the freezing rain, but it broke through the barricade. "Radiator is blown. We have maybe 2 miles before the engine seizes entirely," Dominic yelled, aggressively steering the crippled SUV away from the tunnel and plunging deep into the labyrinthine side streets of Tribeca. "Take us to the Varick Street safe house," Victor commanded, finally sitting back up and pulling Penelope with him. He holstered his weapon and looked at her, his hands gripping her soft shoulders. "Are you hit? Penny, look at me. Are you bleeding?" Penelope frantically patted her uniform, feeling the soft, heavy curves of her waist and thighs. Aside from Oliver Trent's blood staining her apron, she was miraculously unharmed. Her chest heaved, her breath coming in ragged gasps. No, I'm okay. I'm okay." "You saved us," Victor said, his voice dropping an octave, intensely focused on her flushed face. "Twice in one night. You are magnificent under pressure." Nobody had ever called Penelope magnificent. She was used to being called sweet or sturdy. The sheer, unadulterated admiration burning in the Mafia boss's eyes sent a hot, confusing flush of adrenaline straight to her core. The Escalade limped heavily down a narrow, cobblestone alleyway in Tribeca, the engine violently knocking and sputtering before dying completely in front of an unassuming, graffiti-covered industrial garage door. Dominic grabbed a remote from the visor. The heavy steel door rolled up, revealing a pristine, brightly lit subterranean bunker filled with exotic cars, tactical gear, and a wall of secure servers. "Out! Move!" Victor ordered, throwing his door open. Penelope scrambled out of the heavy vehicle, her legs shaking so badly she almost collapsed onto the polished concrete floor. She felt clumsy, her weight suddenly a glaring vulnerability in a situation that demanded athletic agility. But as she stumbled, Victor was instantly there, his massive arm wrapped securely around her thick waist, effortlessly taking her weight and stabilizing her. "I've got you," Victor murmured, his breath hot against her temple. "You're safe now." Dominic hit the remote, and the heavy steel door slammed shut, sealing them inside the fortress and cutting off the sounds of the sirens wailing in the distance. Penelope leaned against the hood of a matte black Porsche 911, struggling to catch her breath, her heart hammering against her ribs. She looked around the billion-dollar bunker, and then looked at Victor, who was already stripping off his ruined suit jacket and moving toward a bank of communication terminals. They had survived the streets, but the war for New Jersey was just beginning. Fluorescent lights hummed steadily above the polished concrete of the Tribeca safehouse, casting a harsh, giving glare over the room. Penelope stripped off her blood-stained black apron, tossing it into a nearby metal trash can with a shudder. Underneath, she wore a simple black button-down and slacks that clung to her generous hips. She felt painfully exposed, entirely out of her element in this sterile, high-tech war room. Yet the adrenaline coursing through her veins refused to let her sit down and panic. Victor Castiglione was a force of nature. He moved between the server racks and a massive digital topographical map of the New York metropolitan area, with the lethal grace of a predator mapping its hunting grounds. He had rolled up the sleeves of his expensive white dress shirt, revealing forearms heavily inked with intricate Sicilian Mafia tattoos and marred by old knife scars. "Dominic, get a secure line to the tactical teams at Maher terminals," Victor barked, tossing a headset to his lieutenant. "I want an exact head count on Caleb Mercer's mercenaries, and patch the radio scanner through the main speakers. Penny needs to hear everything." Penelope startled at the mention of her name. She walked over to the steel communications desk, her soft, quiet steps contrasting with the heavy, frantic energy of the room. She looked at the advanced VHF interceptor. Dominic was booting up. It was military-grade hardware. Stuff she hadn't seen since she was a teenager, sitting in the back of her mother's command tent in Germany. "I can tune the squelch to isolate their command frequency," Penelope offered tentatively, reaching her plump fingers toward the dials. "If Rhine-Ruhr is using standard European mercenary protocol, they'll be hopping frequencies every 3 minutes. My mother taught me how to track the algorithm." Victor stopped dead in his tracks. He turned slowly, staring at the plus-size waitress who was currently casually recalibrating a $50,000 piece of espionage equipment. "Do it," Victor said softly, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his scarred face. Penelope's fingers danced across the dials. She tuned out the paralyzing fear and focused entirely on the math, on the static, on the rhythm of the radio waves. Within 20 seconds, the erratic static cleared, replaced by the crisp, urgent voices of German tactical commanders. "Team Alpha, sichert das Haupttor. Team Bravo, bewegt euch zum Verwaltungsgebäude. Wir suchen den Hauptledger." Penelope grabbed a dry erase marker and stepped up to the thick glass board mounted next to the terminal. She began writing rapidly, her handwriting sharp and precise. "Team Alpha is securing the main gate at Port Newark," Penelope translated aloud, the room falling dead silent to listen to her. "Team Bravo is moving to the administrative building. But Victor, they aren't just looking for Caleb Mercer to hand over the docs. The commander just said they are looking for the Hauptledger." Victor's blood ran cold. "The main ledger." Dominic swore loudly. "Boss, the physical ledger is in the vault at the Broad Street Private Bank. If they get their hands on those hard drives, they have the account numbers, the shell company routing codes, the bribes paid to the Port Authority. They have everything. They don't know it's on Broad Street," Victor deduced rapidly, his eyes narrowing at the map. "Dieter Kaufmann thought the ledger was kept at the Terminal Administration Building. That's why he bought Caleb Mercer. I thought Mercer could just walk into the office and hand him the financial keys to my empire." Penelope listened intensely to the radio, her ear pressed close to the speaker. A new voice broke through the chatter, frantic, panicking, and speaking English. "This is Mercer. They aren't in the terminal safe. The drives aren't here." A cold German voice immediately replied over the radio. "Wo sind Sie, Mercer? Wenn Sie uns anlügen, schneide ich Ihnen die Kehle durch." "Where are they, Mercer? If you lie to us, I will cut your throat." Penelope translated the death threat for Victor. Mercer doesn't know where the Broad Street vault is, Victor said, his voice dripping with venom. Only my inner circle knows. Mercer is a dead man. Wait, wait! Mercer's panicked voice crackled back over the radio. I don't know where the ledger is, but I know who does. Castiglione's accountant. He runs the books out of a penthouse on the Upper East Side. 84th and Lexington. Go there. Dominic's face drained of color. Boss, that's Arthur's apartment. Arthur Castiglione, Victor's 60-year-old uncle. A man who had never fired a gun in his life, who spent his days doing taxes and playing chess in Central Park. They are going to slaughter an old man to get the location of my vault, Victor said, his voice dropping to a terrifying, absolute zero. He slammed his fist onto the steel desk, denting the metal. Dominic, how far away are our strike teams? Stuck on the turnpike, boss. The police have the bridges locked down because of our shootout at the tunnel, Dominic said grimly. We have no soldiers in Manhattan right now. It's just you and me. Victor stared at the map. The Upper East Side was 20 minutes away. The German mercenaries already had a head start. Penelope watched the realization wash over the Mafia boss. I was going to lose his uncle. The math simply didn't work. Unless... Penelope stared at the microphone connected to the VHF interceptor. She looked at Victor, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She was a waitress. She was fat. She was quiet. And she was nobody. But she spoke the language of the wolves. Victor, Penelope said, her voice shaking, but her jaw set in absolute determination. I can buy you time. Victor looked at her, his brow furrowed in confusion. How? Penelope picked up the heavy black radio microphone. She pressed the transmission button, her thumb trembling slightly. She cleared her throat, forcing her vocal cords to tighten, mimicking the harsh, clipped authority of an angry German dispatcher. Team Bravo, hier spricht die Kommandozentrale. Penelope barked into the microphone in flawless, aggressive German, projecting an authority she absolutely did not feel. Abbruch der Mission an der Upper East Side. Das ist eine Falle. Ich wiederhole, es ist eine Falle. Die Polizei ist bereits unterwegs. Ziehen Sie sich sofort zum Sammelpunkt Delta zurück. She released the button and looked at Victor. I just told them command is calling off the Upper East Side raid, Penelope whispered, her hands shaking violently. I told them it was a police trap and ordered them to fall back to a rally point. For 3 agonizing seconds, the radio was completely silent. The air in the bunker was thick enough to cut with a knife. Then the German commander's voice cracked through the speaker. Verstanden. Kommandozentrale. Team Bravo zieht sich zurück. Understood, Command. Team Bravo is pulling back. Dominic let out a breathless, disbelieving laugh. Victor Castiglione stared at Penelope, his chest heaving, his blue eyes blazing with a mixture of absolute awe and raw, undeniable hunger. He crossed the room in 2 massive strides, grabbing her soft face in his large, calloused hands, ignoring the danger, ignoring the war, completely captivated by the brilliant, brave woman standing in front of him. For a moment, the harsh, fluorescent lighting of the underground bunker seemed to completely fade away, leaving only the intoxicating scent of bergamot, rain, and gunpowder. Victor Castiglione's large, scarred hands held Penelope's face with a reverence she had never experienced in her entire 26 years of existence. He didn't look at her as if she were a novelty, nor did he look past her as though she were invisible. He looked at her as if she were the single most magnificent creature he had ever encountered. Before Penelope could draw a breath to apologize or step back, Victor leaned down and crashed his mouth against hers. The kiss was explosive, born of pure adrenaline and staggering relief. It wasn't gentle, but it wasn't cruel. It was a total, consuming claiming. Penelope gasped into his mouth, her hands instinctively flying up to grip his broad, muscular shoulders to keep her balance. Victor groaned, his arms sliding down from her face to wrap securely around her thick, soft waist, pulling her flush against his solid frame. For years, she had meticulously hidden her body in oversized sweaters and dark aprons, deeply ashamed of taking up space. Now, crushed against the most dangerous man on the eastern seaboard, her curves felt entirely right. They grounded him. When Victor finally pulled back, they were both breathing heavily. His blue eyes blazed with an undeniable, ferocious heat. "You are brilliant," Victor murmured, his forehead resting against hers. "Do you understand what you just did? You just saved my family." "I just bought us a window," Penelope whispered, her cheeks burning a bright, beautiful crimson. She gently stepped back, her mind instantly snapping back to the tactical reality of the radio intercept. She pointed a trembling finger at the map on the wall. "Victor, we have to move now. Standard Munich tactical doctrine dictates that Rally Point Delta is always the nearest unsecured maritime extraction zone. For this grid, that's the abandoned dry docks at the Brooklyn Navy Yard. They are funneling all their surviving mercenaries into a single bottleneck." Dominic, who had been respectfully looking away during their intense embrace, snapped his head toward the map. "She's right, boss. The Navy Yard is completely isolated at this hour. If they are massing there to wait for an extraction boat, they are sitting ducks," Victor finished, his voice dropping into a lethal, predatory register. Penelope looked at the radio receiver, her eyes narrowing as she analyzed the frequency hopping. "These aren't standard cartel thugs, Mr. Castiglione. The encryption hardware they are using is manufactured by the Thales Group, and judging by their unit cohesion over the comms, Dieter hired ex-operatives from Constellis, real, heavily trained private military contractors. Your men need to go in heavy." Victor looked at her, shaking his head in absolute disbelief and admiration. A waitress who could identify top-tier defense contractors and military doctrine by listening to a radio squelch. "Dominic," Victor commanded, never taking his eyes off Penelope. "Divert the New Jersey strike teams. The police blockade at the tunnel won't matter if our boys take the speedboats across the harbor. Box the Germans in at the Brooklyn Navy Yard. I want heavy suppressive fire. Leave no survivors." "It's done," Dominic said, grabbing his secure satellite phone and rapidly barking orders into the receiver. The bunker fell into a tense, agonizing wait as the digital clocks on the servers ticked toward dawn. Penelope sat on a heavy steel crate, her adrenaline finally crashing, leaving her shivering. Victor noticed immediately. He retrieved a heavy black cashmere overcoat from the back seat of a parked Mercedes and gently draped it over her broad shoulders, letting his hands linger on her collar. 45 minutes later, Dominic's phone vibrated. He pressed it to his ear, a slow, grim smile spreading across his face. "The Navy Yard is clear, boss," Dominic reported. "Total wipeout. The German mercenary threat is neutralized. Uncle Arthur is perfectly safe in his penthouse, and Caleb Mercer was just found hiding in a shipping container at Port Newark. Our boys handled him." Victor nodded slowly. The war was over. He had won. He walked over to the communications desk and picked up a specialized landline receiver. He punched in a secure code that connected directly to the Monarch Room's basement holding area. "Put him on," Victor said coldly into the phone. A moment later, the terrified, weeping voice of Dieter Kaufmann echoed over the bunker's main speaker system. "Castiglione, bitte, bitte lassen Sie uns einen Deal machen." "Castiglione, please, let's make a deal." Victor held the phone out to Penelope. "Tell him, Penny. Tell him it's over." Penelope stood up, clutching the lapels of Victor's oversized cashmere coat. She looked at the speaker, thinking of the way Dieter had sneered at her, the way he had called her a fat bitch, the way he had casually ordered the slaughter of hundreds of men. She didn't feel like a terrified waitress anymore. The fire of the underworld had forged something entirely new inside her. She leaned toward the microphone. "Ihre Söldner sind tot, Dieter," Penelope said, her German flawless, dripping with absolute ice. "Der Brooklyn Navy Yard ist ein Friedhof. Sie haben ihr Imperium an eine Kellnerin verloren. Your mercenaries are dead, Dieter. The Brooklyn Navy Yard is a graveyard. You lost your empire to a waitress." Dieter let out a horrifying, guttural sob of absolute defeat. Victor took the phone back, his eyes locked on Penelope with burning pride. "Shoot him," Victor ordered into the receiver. "And dump Oliver Trent's body in the Hudson." The muffled sound of 2 distant gunshots echoed through the speaker before the line went dead. The silence that followed was absolute. The Rhine-Ruhr Syndicate's hostile takeover was completely dismantled. Dawn began to break over Manhattan, the first rays of grey light filtering through the high, reinforced ventilation shafts of the bunker. Victor walked over to Penelope, offering her his hand. "Where are we going?" she asked softly, placing her plump, soft hand into his massive, scarred one. "Home," Victor said simply. "My penthouse in Hoboken. Dominic's men have already retrieved your cat, Barnaby, and your belongings. You are never setting foot in a restaurant kitchen ever again, Penelope." "Victor, I don't know how to be in this world," she whispered, anxiety flaring in her chest. "I'm just me." "And you is exactly what I need," Victor replied, pulling her close. "You are going to be the head of my International Intelligence Division. You will sit at my right hand. And anyone who ever dares to look down on you, for any reason, will answer directly to my gun." Penelope looked up into his bruised winter sky eyes. For the first time in her life, she wasn't hiding. She stepped forward, fully embracing the dangerous, beautiful king of the underworld, ready to rule an empire built on blood, loyalty, and a single translated whisper. Did Penelope's brilliant, quick-thinking takedown of a billionaire crime syndicate leave you absolutely breathless? Sometimes the most invisible people in the room are the most dangerous ones. If you loved this high-stakes mafia romance, the intense tactical warfare, and watching a brilliant, plus-size heroine claim her rightful crown beside a ruthless mafia boss, smash that like button. Don't forget to share this story with your friends who love suspenseful thrillers and explosive romantic twists. Subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss another heart-pounding, real-life drama.